My name is Josh Guetzkow. I am currently on the faculty, as you mentioned, as an assistant professor, or some would say associate. They have a different ranking system. Anyway, I'm in Israel at the Hebrew University in the Department of Sociology and the Institute of Criminology. The PhD in sociology from Princeton University, where I learned statistics and research methods, and a postdoc I did at Harvard in health policy. So I feel, I don't necessarily have
obviously
specific
that
expertise in
Yeah, no, I was going to say, obviously, that prepares you for pandemics, but I was joking.
Yeah.
So I apologize for interrupting. Please carry on.
No problem. I think there's a little bit of a delay here. Just saying, I don't have specific training in epidemiology or things like that, but I have sort of a wide and in-depth knowledge of general things related to statistics and research design and that sort of thing, which applies across the board. It doesn't matter. Just because you're looking at medical issues suddenly doesn't mean that a messed up research design is okay.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as analyzing VAERS and stuff like that, it's not rocket science. It's pretty bog standard.
So let's get into the meat of what you've been up to, and what can you give us just a kind of a broad summary of what your thoughts are right now? What have you been finding, and what does it mean for people?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that I've stumbled upon, the CDC and the FDA made an announcement that they had found a possible safety signal for ischemic stroke following the bivalent booster. Now, do you remember that, Randy?
No, I do not. Please.
Okay, it was plastered all over. Now, what was interesting about that is they made the announcement actually about a month or so after they'd actually found the signal, and they spent some time looking into it. So they were able to make the announcement and basically say at the same time or a day or two later, well, we found the signal, but we've already looked into it, and it doesn't really hold up. But what they didn't tell you about, and what most people haven't heard about, and which we found out about, we've gotten information on this through a Freedom of Information Act request that was filed by Zach Stieber at the Epoch Times, is that they've done a VAERS safety signal analysis. The CDC did, they started doing it in March 2022, all the way through the end of July 2022, and they found over 600 safety signals for adults from the regular COVID-19 vaccines. And nobody heard about it. It didn't make it into any other publication, mainstream publication. The only publication that talked about it was Epoch Times. So, what is a safety signal, right? What is the significance of that? So, I don't know how much on your podcast you've discussed VAERS, the vaccine adverse events.
Oh, we have quite a bit. Yeah. Yep.
Right. So what is it for? What is the VAERS system for? It's to detect safety signals, right? From a new vaccine. And, they have a similar monitoring system for regular medications. And the VAERS is just the specific one they have for vaccines. So it's touted as the early warning system that they have. And in meetings with congressional leaders prior to the rollout of the vaccines, they assured them that they were going to mount the most comprehensive safety monitoring campaign ever, including VAERS and being able to detect signals early through reports to VAERS. So it's a very important system. They spend tens of millions of dollars on it every year. And how do they go about detecting a safety signal? What would count as a safety signal? And the basic idea is that they look at the proportion or the percentage of adverse events of a particular type of adverse event. Let's say myocarditis, okay? And they compare the reporting rate of myocarditis out of all adverse event reports for that new vaccine to the rate of reporting of myocarditis to a previous vaccine or previous vaccines. So if 5% of all reports for COVID vaccines are from myocarditis, and 5% of all reports for other vaccines are myocarditis, then it's the same rate and there's no safety signal. Okay. What they want to see is a doubling of the rate. They want to see that the rate is at least twice as much. So if 10% of all reports for the COVID vaccines were for myocarditis compared to 5% for other vaccines. So that's twice as big. And if it's twice as big and you have enough numbers of reports, it'll be statistically significant. And then they can say, oh, we have a safety signal. And the safety signal doesn't mean that it's causing the problem. It means that they've detected a potential problem and they need to follow up with more research, right? And they have all kinds of data and methods they can use to do that. We could talk about the problems with that, and they don't do a very good job with that either. But just on the face of it, if you detect a signal in VAERS, you should be following up on it. And they've detected 660, and that's just for adults. 660 safety signals, many of which are very, very severe. You can go through some of that if you want. And they haven't followed up, as far as we know, on any of them. Not one. And they didn't notify anybody. The public certainly hasn't been notified about this. So on the one hand, they're blasting through the every available news outlet about this one potential safety signal that turned out not to be a safety signal, while completely ignoring 660 others that they found.
So what category are these 659 other different diagnoses? What determines a safety signal?
So there's a system that regulatory agencies use to code adverse events. Okay, there's a list of codes. There's a hierarchy of different codes through what's called the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities, MEDRA. And so when somebody puts in a report to VAERS, usually it's a medical professional, but sometimes it's a person, but they'll just type in a bunch of stuff. They might fill out some fields and stuff like that. But then somebody who's working for the CDC has outsourced all private companies, but somebody sitting behind a keyboard looking at that report and coding it according to this coding system, the MEDRA coding system. Okay, so when you talk about an adverse event, you're talking about a certain type of code within this system called preferred term. It's kind of like the lowest level. So you could imagine, if I had something wrong with my stomach, so they would list it as the specific problem, gastric increase, gastric acid increase, I don't know, something like that. Right. And then that would be coded like that. And then there's a higher level categories like gastrointestinal problems. So that would be part of that category, but that's a higher level. The lower level, they're called preferred terms. Okay, so if you look in VAERS, everybody's ever looked at VAERS, the frontline reports that you get are at this level, this preferred term category. So when we're talking about 660 safety signals, we're talking about these preferred terms that we're seeing. They were seeing 660 different preferred terms that were elevated to such a degree that they fill all the criteria for what they call a safety signal. So and we could look at what some of those are. So one of the things that I did is I went through the list that we had and I kind of tried to group them together into different types of problems, like cardiac problems, thromboembolic problems. So I don't know if you want to share the
which one would that be? I'm going to go to your.
That would be from that link that I sent you from my Substack, jackanapes.substack.com.
So what's the date? Is that
it's the top? It's at the very top of
January.
It's at the very top. It's pinned to the top of the page, or you can click the link that I sent through the chat. And
is it one?
Yeah, that's it. So if you scroll down, you'll see some tables. This just gives some. There was a doubling in the rate of reporting for serious adverse events compared to previous vaccines they compared to. Okay, so this shows you the main categories of the different reports, and then the number of reports that they got that were reported to those different categories. So the largest number of reports they got were for cardiovascular issues, and then neural, thromboembolic, pulmonary, menstrual, death, hemorrhagic problems, gastrointestinal, hematological, immunological, cancer, or neoplasms, as they call it. And then there are some other ones that are kind of miscellaneous that I didn't put there. So that's kind of like the broad view. But if you want to look like at the next, you just click on the arrow to the right, you get to the cardiovascular.
Yeah, this is the next slide.
I'm not seeing it. Randy, are you?
Yeah, it says major cardiovascular.
Somebody's frozen here.
It says major cardiovascular event safety signals. This is the next slide.
Okay, now I'm seeing it. Okay, great. Now I've got it. Now I'm seeing it too. So the biggest one, well, so they're the two big ones that aren't on this. Okay, the two biggest ones are chest pain and palpitations. But then you've got atrial fibrillations, irregular heartbeats, myocarditis, cardiac failure, cardiac arrest, pericarditis, cardiac flutter. Okay, I mean, so it goes, and there's a lot more than this. There's cardiovascular. Those are just the big, the ones that had the most kind of reports associated with them in the VAERS system. And these are all among the preferred events where they found a safety signal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then, so again, a safety signal doesn't mean that necessarily that something, look at the neurological ones, and I guess your audience can go to my website and look at that. But one of the other things to keep in mind here is that had a stronger safety signal than the safety signal for myocarditis, right? So we know that myocarditis is a problem. It's elevated. There's an elevation of myocarditis after vaccination, after the second vaccine specifically. And so if anything has a higher safety signal, stronger safety signal than myocarditis, on the face of it, there's a good reason to suspect that it might be caused by the vaccine and really needs to be investigated. And here we're seeing, 2/3 of these 660, over 500 of these categories of these different adverse events have a stronger signal than myocarditis.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you want to skip to.
Yep.
Just go through quickly. Just look at the neurological ones, or.
Okay.
I think okay.
Well, here we go. Neurologic.
Right. I think yeah. So you've got tinnitus. Now tinnitus is a big one because I don't know why it's not getting bigger than that, but tinnitus is has been associated apparently, and I learned this from vaccine injured groups, is that tinnitus is the one adverse event that is most closely connected to suicide. People are hearing this loud ringing noise.
It's like almost like a horror movie kind of thing.
Oh yeah, just imagine you have this loud ringing in your ears, that can even be painful all the time, 24/7. You can't even get to sleep because you have this ringing. Right? That would drive you insane. And there's lots of evidence that the vaccines increase the risk of tinnitus. Lots of published research showing that there's an increase of tinnitus. And in fact, I think the European Medicines Agency has acknowledged this increased risk of tinnitus after vaccination. American authorities haven't, but so you get your Bell's palsy and your dementia and
right. Those are not.
And there are other problems. Paresthesia, which is like a tingling. It can be a painful tingling sensation that you get. Here, the only two paresthesias that had a safety signal were for oral and pharyngeal, which is in your ear. But that is, according to poll that was done among vaccine injured, they were asked if there was one thing that you could get rid of, one adverse event, one thing that happened to you that you could get rid of, what would it be? And the number one answer was paresthesia.
Right.
So, yeah. And, the list goes on. And of course, you've got all the menstrual injuries. Here's your blood clotting adverse events that you're to scroll down to, right? Clots in the brain that cause a stroke. It's another term for stroke. There are many different terms for strokes in this, and I had another slide, I think, in another presentation where I looked at all the different stroke. There's something like 26 different terms for stroke that have a safety signal in this FOIA request, or the answer to the FOIA request. Right, and you didn't hear about any of those 26. All you heard about was that one from the bivalent booster that turned out to not really be even relevant.
So
and it's another thing. I just want to say that even though the CDC and FDA have ruled out, they've already said that this stroke signal is probably nothing. They still have this very, very elaborate plan of how they're going to go about and continue to look into it, continue to study it. And so why are they developing all the elaborate plans for that one safety signal on a vaccine that almost nobody is taking,
right,
compared to all of these 26 other stroke safety signals for these other vaccines? It doesn't make any sense.
So is this all from the bivalent one, or is this from the previous?
No, this is just the previous ones. I don't think they differentiated between dose. So basically it could be from the first dose, second dose, or third dose, or technically even the fourth dose. They did stratify it by age. So what we're looking at here is just the adverse events
across the board
for adults 18 to 65. If you scroll down a bit more, you'll see a table that lists. So they had 66 safety signals for the 12 to 17-year-olds, which includes, some of it is not that. Some of it isn't that serious, but some of it is very serious, right? Like Bell's palsy and genital ulcerations. And why are 12 to 17-year-olds having thromboses and pulmonary embolisms and cardiac valve incompetencies, immune thrombocytopenia, which is something that's been acknowledged as a problem with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the AstraZeneca, right? But no for the mRNA vaccines, they've given them a pass. They don't increase your risk.
They don't follow up. I know that was always weird to me that they were very much on the tail of Johnson & Johnson. I mean, I think that they've had the fingers on the scale, and the mRNAs. It's an experiment, which should I'm not against experimenting with mRNA vaccines as a new concept, so forth. But they shouldn't have experimented on the whole globe. They shouldn't have experimented on kids. They shouldn't have experimented on pregnant women. They shouldn't have experimented on women who are likely to get pregnant, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to experiment on, say, 85-year-olds, I mean, at the time, under duress, that's fine. People who have very little, future are not likely to have very many long-term side effects. But if you have a lot of long-term on your ledger, you're young, you're a 12-year-old. This is crazy. This is all done in the event of 12 to 17-year-olds not having any problem from the illness itself. And
right.
This is crazy. I mean, I do want to just point out for our fans and viewers that some of the scales, the numeric scales on the bottom vary. So, I'm going to.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right.
I want to just point out that these are different in scale. If you look in the bottom here.
Yes, so you're right, and thank you for pointing that out.
This scale here is number of AEs, adverse events. This is the 10. These are in the thousands and 14,000. If we go back. These are in the thousands. This overall, these are in the 70s. These are tens of thousands. So these have different. I don't know, but they're really. I would call them the y-axis, but they're sideways. So the x-axis over here. And so I just want to bring that to people's attention that some of these things are less than others. So I don't want to go nuts over every episode of bowel Crohn's disease and so forth, because I don't think those are necessarily significant. I do think it's interesting that a lot of the itis ones. I mean, this group suffix, whatever here, colitis, appendicitis, myocarditis. A lot of these things, the itis means inflammation. And so I think there is some aspect that people should be thinking about, not tinnitus, of course, that's actually different, but myocarditis, pericarditis. These are things that involve inflammation, and inflammation is a good and a bad thing. I like to just always point out, people always want to take anti-inflammatories, and the question is one man's inflammation is another man's healing. So if you have a cut and you scrape your knee, you're going to have inflammation at the area, but you want to have inflammation because otherwise your knee doesn't heal. So those same cells that are healing cells are called inflammation when you don't want it. So when you're getting a problem that you don't want, it's inflammation. When it's healing, it's healing. But those are the same exact process, same exact cells. But the question is, why is there this itis? Why is inflammation happening? And I think because in this case, there's an unnecessary, scrape, as it were. You have a scrape when you're playing basketball. Well, you had to play basketball, but you're having a scrape in your heart because you have the vaccine, but you didn't have to have this vaccine. So I just want to point that out for viewers. I'm sorry.
No, thank you. While we're on this screen, you notice that appendicitis is one of the high number, and it's also mentioned on the 12 to 17 and the 5 to 11 not mentioned, it's found as a safety signal. And it's interesting because there was a large study done in Israel on the safety of the COVID-19 vaccines. There are problems with the study, and they only looked at some 24 different adverse events, but one of them was appendicitis. And they found an increased risk of appendicitis after vaccination that they didn't find after a COVID-19 infection. So this fact that you have this safety signal there is actually supported by published literature. I mean, there are, a lot of these are supported by the published literature. There are actually about 3,000 case series reports that have now been published on people who had something happen to them after the vaccine. So you put all of the data together, and the picture doesn't look good. If you go one more, you'll get to the 5 to 11-year-old list. I mean, if there's any silver lining here, it's that there weren't a ton of safety signals for the 12 to 17-year-olds and the 5 to 11-year-olds. I think that what there is concerning, no doubt about it.
Well, especially these over here. A little bit of myocarditis can ruin your day. Myocarditis is we hadn't heard much about it in the before times, as I like to call it. In the before times, myocarditis, I've seen patients over probably about almost 40 years, and I've seen had seen a handful of cases of myocarditis, hardly any. Pericarditis as well, very, very rare, because your heart is frankly pretty well insulated. We don't see that many encephalitis because your brain's pretty well insulated. Your heart, not that many things happen to those things. Your heart, it's an incredible machine. It's working. It's it's a muscle that's going on and on and on and on and on forever. And it doesn't really, happen. Nothing happens that much. You don't get heart cancer. Sometimes the muscle kind of wears out a little bit, get congestive heart failure, but as far as inflammation of it, it's pretty rare phenomenon. I'm not sure precisely whether, there's a blood-brain barrier, but I'm not sure there's a cardiac barrier. So why that is an open question. But, here we're seeing a lot of this, and the two questions. One is, what would have happened just from COVID itself? My own my pre-answer is that in this age group, kids didn't get any symptoms at all from COVID. It's unlikely they're going to get myocarditis without even having much in the way of COVID-19, respiratory illness. But I've mentioned this many times, but I was literally screamed at by somebody at my tennis club who's an MD, NPH, and he works in the public health system here in Massachusetts, and he was all over me for not being thrilled about vaccines for kids. And he said, well, you're whatever. What about the children? It was kind of reverse. What about the children? It was, what about society? But my feeling was that he said, well, you can get myocarditis and pericarditis from the illness itself. I said, well, okay, fine. Even if we stipulate that's true, most of these kids have already been exposed to it. So why give them the additional burden of a vaccine to an illness to which they've already exposed when natural immunity has always previously in the before times trumped vaccine? Anyway, so that's kind of an anecdote. I'm not sure you can comment on that per se, but
yeah, no, absolutely. I gave comments to the FDA VRB PAC committee, the outside expert committee. They have the public comment period. I gave comments on the meeting where they met to vote on the vaccine for the 5 to 11-year-olds, the Pfizer vaccine. And even based on their own data, just pulling out data that they had published in MMWR, you could see that they were looking at what percentage of teenagers had been, this is from their VSafe data, had been in the hospital in the week following vaccination, just 1 week following. If you add more weeks, you get even more. And it was a startlingly, it wasn't a very high percentage in absolute terms, but for being in the emergency room or the hospital after a vaccination was very high. And they weren't, that was one of the many things that they didn't take into consideration. The only thing they took into consideration in their cost benefit analysis was myocarditis, but none of the other, and then they completely lowballed their expected rate of myocarditis. I don't want to get into all that. Anyway, one thing I will say is that, I was talking about a silver lining here, that there aren't that many safety signals or very serious ones for this age group. But the other part of this is that if there's a symptom that's reported for the COVID-19 vaccines that was never reported for the comparator vaccines, where here what they're doing is they're comparing the COVID vaccines to reports for all vaccines since 2009. Mm-hmm. If you never had something reported for those other vaccines for this age group, for example, it will never come up. It will never register as a safety signal. You could have 10,000 reports of something, and if it never was reported for a previous vaccine, by the definition of how they define what a safety signal is, it wouldn't count as a safety signal, which is pretty absurd. So, the other possibility here is that there are some things that are being reported, for this age group that are that were never, that are very serious, but were not reported previously. And that's actually something that I've been meaning to go back and look at. But
so you're saying, if I understand that let's pick one, say pericarditis was never a signal for flu shots for 5 to 11.
No, that's not what I'm saying.
Okay.
What I'm saying is, to have a safety signal, you have to compare reports for a new vaccine to reports for an established vaccine, right?
Okay.
So,
right. If some previous vaccine like pertussis didn't have this, it wouldn't necessarily.
You would never see it. If nobody had ever reported myocarditis after pertussis vaccine, say, and you were comparing it to the pertussis vaccine, then even if you were getting 10,000 reports of myocarditis, if you had 0 reports for the previous vaccine, it wouldn't register as a safety signal.
Because it's kind of like with your Texas Instrument calculators, you divide the number and you get that, something divided by 0, you get the crazy EE.
That's
whatever.
Exactly what it is. You can't get that. You can't divide by 0, and that's right. Whereas you would think that if something's coming up now for this vaccine that you didn't see for 20 or for 13 years for any other vaccine, that probably we should probably look into that. But they, it's just like they're just completely blind to it.
Oh my. All right.
So yeah.
So I got
this was
carry on.
Oh, this was brought. This FOIA information was brought to the attention of the FDA's outside committee at their previous meeting. I forget what they were discussing, the booster strategy or whatever, and they didn't say anything about it. They didn't care. None of the outside committee members. I don't think they listened to the comment period, frankly. But if they are listening, they didn't care. They didn't say anything.
Well, this is kind of sad, I guess, in a way. And I had a side question. We have not really been able to see Well, I've looked many times. You actually have my quote here. What about the children?
Oh, was that you? I didn't.
No. It's kind of a common plaint here. People, whenever somebody wants to do anything, it's kind of a meme joke from the before times. People want to, I don't know, fix a pothole in the street, and people, well, it's kind of like NIMBY, not in my backyard. But the other one is like, what about the children? You want to do something. It's like, what about the children? People were always like previously concerned, like, what about the children?
Right.
We have to consider them first. And here, they seem to have been considered last. And it's kind of, in my view, a cowardly approach to the whole pandemic that again, I love my old people like crazy. Getting back to my tennis club, I play the old guys. I play the 85-year-olds and the 87. We play doubles. And I was enlisted, God rest his soul, one of the great members, ex-president of the club, and he's a terrific athlete. Anyway, but he was old. He was in his late 80s, and he and his son, my age, we played doubles for a couple of years, 3 years. I love my old guys. I love my old women. We took care of my mother-in-law in our basement for 10 years, and we would have let her out if she'd wanted to, but she wasn't in that position. I used to say, people say, how is she? I said, she's happy as a clam. But in precisely the same ways that theoretically we don't know whether clams are happy, but in the same precise ways that clams might be happy, which is to be ensconced in the place, warm, comfortable, fed, and so forth, and not getting out that much and not looking around. So she was literally as happy as a clam, doing her crossword puzzles and all that kind of stuff for 10 years. She was mentally fine, and we kept her all clean and everything during COVID. She died from something else completely different, like a few months ago. And again, may she rest in peace.
Sorry to hear that.
We got her through COVID. I'm not against old people. I love my old people.
Yeah.
I'm frankly, I'm being one someday, and I'm hoping. I mean, I'm not that lovable. I'm not that lovable, but I'm hoping somebody takes care of me with the same assiduousness my wife did for her mom, and ditto with my mom. I took care of her for financially for like 40, 50 years or something like that. And she was widowed back in the 70s. Anyway, so love my old people. Stipulate, but I love my kids also. And I love my potential kids and all the young people and so forth. And there's no reason to shortchange them. It should have been, what about the children? Lockdowns, closing down the playground, covering over. I've seen that absurd one. They had the 2x4s on a basketball net, so that you couldn't shoot a basket in. I mean, sometimes when the Celtics play, I feel as if that's there theoretically. They missed like 16.
That's funny.
Anyway. But there were literal ones, and they covered the skateboard parks with sand. And where there was sand on the beach, you couldn't go to the beach. You couldn't skateboard on the beach. You couldn't skateboard on the skateboard. You couldn't the skimboard on the beach. You couldn't skateboard on the sand. It was craziness. They had the police boats go out after the one guy who's swimming by himself. Total lunacy. I'm just going to I'm on a riff here, so I apologize. But the medications haven't kicked in. But I had Human Hamati on my show, and he's a physician out in California, and everyone really loves this one anecdote he gave, which is he wanted to go swimming, and he lives near the beach in California, Southern California, and they wouldn't let anybody in. So he grew out his beard. He got a watch cap and got tattered up his clothing and whatever he did. He got mismatched up and he shuffled off with bad shoes or whatever, and he was homeless. And so he went out to the beach and stripped down whatever and went swimming. And the police wouldn't go near him because he was homeless. And it's just an incredible thing that in a way, in order to get anything, you have to have the enemy, you have to have namelessness in order to profit by a system that definitely perpetrated and penetrated and kind of prejudiced against actual people trying to live their lives in an appropriate way.
Yeah, absolutely. Really upside down. You want to stop the screen share, maybe?
Well, I was going to do that, but you our faces are laggy, so I thought.
Oh, okay. All right, that's fine. Whatever.
This was the better part of valor.
I see.
I don't think you're laggy right now.
Okay. Well, one thing that I cover in this post is all of the arguments against VAERS. right? So you start telling people that the number of VAERS reports has gone through the roof. And what do they say? One of the first things they'll tell you is, oh, well, that's because we started vaccinating so many more people. Well, first of all, first of all, the way that they calculate a safety signal doesn't have anything to do with the number of vaccines. It's the rate of reporting of a particular type of vaccine out of all reports for that vaccine. And in fact, if you have an increased number of reporting for a particular vaccine, that could actually tend to lower your safety signal, lower the likelihood of finding a safety signal, because every report becomes less as a percentage of all reports. And then the other thing is that if you look at it, you can look at it per vaccine dose that's administered. And if you do that, you still see a ton of safety signals. So that, that argument is just irrelevant. And then they say, well, there's all these anti-vaxxers and people are just doing anything that happens to them before they, anything that happens to them while they're after they've gotten vaccinated, they'll connect it to the vaccine and report it to VAERS. But in fact, the CDC has, first of all, it's the CDC system and the FDA system, the government system. If they have a problem with it, they need to fix it. But they actually think that the data quality, they use VAERS reports to publish in some of the best medical journals, right? And they have a methodology for determining whether or not the increase in reporting is due to people reporting more often than they normally would, right? Like people say it's inflated because people are connecting everything to the vaccine, or because of fear, or anti-vaxxers, or because the government said they need to report, or whatever. They actually have a methodology. And if you use it to determine if that's really what's driving the increase in reporting, and if you use that methodology, you can see very clearly that that's not what's going on here, right? Based on their own methodology. It may be the case for some things, but not most things. People say VAERS isn't reliable. Well, if VAERS isn't reliable, why are they able to publish in the best medical journals using VAERS data? Mm-hmm. In fact, the paper they published in JAMA on myocarditis, they went through every myocarditis report, and they said about 80% of them had enough information and seemed reliable enough to be included and analyzed as part of their myocarditis analysis from VAERS. So, why are 80% of the myocarditis reports reliable enough to be published in JAMA, but all of the rest of VAERS is garbage, right? You can't make heads or tails of it. It just doesn't wash. It just, none of the arguments against VAERS wash, and ultimately it is just a safety signal detection system. That's what it's built for, but it's not being used for it. And might I remind you what I told you at the beginning, which is that this safety signal analysis that was obtained through a FOIA request, they only started doing it in March 2022 after we were requesting to see their safety signal analysis, which, according to a document on the CDC website from late January 2021, outlined exactly what they were going to do for their safety signal analysis. They were going to do these weekly beginning in January, February 2021. And they waited a full 15 months before the vaccines rolled out, before they started to do even one of these. One safety signal analysis. They have millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars.
Craziness. Let me ask you a side question. I was trying to find all this stuff during we had the before times, and now we have the after times. During times of lockdown and so forth, I was trying to, hunt down our CDC. Israel had a better kind of parsed and segregated and spreadsheetable database. Did you find, and have you searched the Israeli data for the same type of signals as we're seeing in VAERS? And does Israel, I assume it doesn't participate in VAERS. I assume that's a U.S. enterprise. But when I was looking, were the signals there, do they coincide with the Israeli data? Were they more quickly found amongst the Israeli data? Because I remember seeing, reports about myocarditis increase in young boys and so forth, or young men from Israel. Almost all these things came out first there. How accessible was, just on a gross level, how accessible was the data there were the data there versus here? And have you found the same thing secondarily?
Okay, so VAERS can, many reports to VAERS are international, and you can actually divide up if it's national data, you want national data or to include the international accounts. They often get those from regulatory agencies abroad, or the vaccine manufacturers, they get a report from abroad and they have to submit it to VAERS. Israel did not have a functioning system like VAERS for a very long time. They had something that didn't even allow you to put in your contact information, so they had no way to follow you up. Nobody knew about it. It had you had a very limited text field where you could input a very limited number of characters. There were some predefined things. It was basically useless. What they were doing in Israel is they had a second system that was for medical personnel to report vaccine adverse events. And that's what they were reporting on. They did, I think every month they were publishing a report based on that. But that was very, very heavily underreported, first of all, because most doctors were unwilling to. So normally the way pharmacovigilance systems work is that you report everything, whether you think it's related or not, and then you let you analyze it afterwards to figure out what's going on and if there's a signal. You're not supposed to censor yourself from reporting, but that's what doctors did. They were kind of discouraged even from reporting. Okay, in some cases, but in most cases they just were unwilling to accept that many things could be related to the vaccine, and therefore they never reported it. And we also know doctors who did report things whose reports didn't show up in the monthly report. Right? They reported to the system, but somebody at the other end in the Ministry of Health curated the reports and deleted some reports, like on deaths and things like that. So their system was trash, and they recognized this approximately in September, and by December of 2021, when they were about to roll out the vaccines for the kids, they created a new system, and then they hired some researchers from an Israeli hospital to analyze the data from their new system. Of course, most everybody had already had their vaccines by the time they started this new system. So, some people reported retrospectively, but most people didn't. But anyway, there was a closed door meeting that was captured. There was a recording that was leaked. The closed door meeting with these medical researchers presenting their results to people at the Ministry of Health, saying things like, many of these things that we're seeing got worse after the first dose, then they got better, then they got worse after the second dose, and they call this a re-challenge. And they said this is indication that this is a causal, that the vaccines are causing this problem, and there were different problems that they recognized for this. So that was one of the things. They said there are things that we're seeing here that Pfizer hasn't reported on. They said they've never seen, that haven't been reported in the medical literature. We need to report on it. There were some other things about it, but basically all of that stuff was kept hidden. And the Ministry of Health a few months later did release a report from these researchers, but essentially buried all of these things that they were saying, like that there are new things that we're finding that aren't reported, that there's indications of causal relationships. So in the report, the official report, they said nothing new here and nothing causal. So the Ministry of Health is actively covering up adverse events. It's interesting. I did a comparison. They did a survey after the first booster. And that's my Twitter at JoshG99. Anyway, they did a survey of adverse events after the first booster, which was very, very telling. That's also on my Substack. Very high rates of several different adverse events that were much, 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 much higher than they were getting from this reporting system that they were using, the one that the doctors were reporting to. So the numbers, there are hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of times less reports in that system than you would get if you extrapolate it from the survey they did of people who had gotten the booster. If you extrapolate from that to like the number of people that got doses, The reporting was very, very underreported, and we know that. We know that VAERS is underreported.
Right.
We know that
So,
the Israeli system was underreported. So they did a good job with myocarditis. I have to give them that, but
yeah,
that was about it.
So we're rounding out towards the end of my personal hour here. So I'm going to have to thank you for bringing all this up, and I'd like people to check out your Substack and your Twitter feed, and I mean we can talk about warning words and last words and all that kind of stuff. I think if you're not, I forget what the quote is, but you have to be basically eternally vigilant. Nothing is a given, unfortunately. People are inherently lazy, and they inherently act towards their kind of salaries, where they're being paid to go. So this is madness. I appreciate your stalwart work. It's been great getting to know you, and I thank you so much for your time. I just before I leave every episode, I always put in my own shameless self-promotion here. I have a book, Overturning Zika, the Pandemic That Never Was. There are a lot of ancillary lessons here from this book. I would like people to go check it out. A, because it will bring me my own financial incentives, but B, because there's a lot of the same characters are in this book. Dr. Fauci's, WHO, CDC, all that kind of stuff. And everyone kind of is gung-ho towards making something kind of a mountain out of a molehill. But with Zika, and of course it disappeared, and I mean it's no big deal for us because it's only in Brazil and only in the tropics. But there's 3.5 billion people in the tropics that are still affected by this without any kind of surcease in the scaremongering about it. And so my book is literally trying to overturn that last pandemic, as the basis of it was factitious. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there.
Okay, great.
Any last words? 5 seconds, 10 seconds.
No, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Well, Josh, you were wonderful. And I'm sorry, I apologize to everybody that there was some lag on the video end, but it's kind of an amazing thing. It happens at all. He's in Israel, I'm sitting in Massachusetts, and it's amazing we could have this. I hope you pass this along and share it widely. Josh, you can stay on for 1 second more, but I'm going to say goodbye to everybody else. Thank you so much.